Good morning, everyone. Fun fact about me, sorry, I don't know if that's me or, I'll just keep talking. Fun fact about me, I was a youth pastor for 4 years, and I really love seeing, students on stage and serving, and having volunteers come up and serve out student ministry. Let alone a middle school teacher, that was impressive to me. Like, I spent, part of my week with middle schoolers. I can't imagine spending 40 hours a week with them and then coming back to serve more. They're a crazy group, and it takes a special kind of heart to serve them, but don't take that for granted. They're so important, and this church is, you guys are doing such a good job with students. So, that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I just wanted to say that. I was walking around in Winona Lake with my wife. We live there, and there was someone who came across us while they were riding her bike from our church, and I was with my daughter, and she approached us and talked to us. We talked to her for probably 5 minutes, and she knew a lot about us. She asked me how my grad program process was going, what progress I was making there. We talked about, Winona Lake. We actually live in the same neighborhood, which we didn't know. And we talked to her for, probably good 5 minutes, and then she rode on her way. We kept walking. And after we were done talking, my wife turned to me, and she goes, who was that? And I said, babe, I don't know. I have no idea who that was. I was a youth pastor. I served in the church, so I came across a lot of people who I knew kind of from a distance, and they knew more about me than I knew about them, and that was an example. I didn't really know who that person was, and apparently we did a good job of speaking it because she was talking to us for a while, and it was just a funny experience. I came to later find out her name is Kat, and she actually knows our daughter too because she works with our student ministry, or our kids ministry. But I don't know if I'm the only one here with a kind of a story like that. I have a feeling that I'm not. I hear it a lot. You're walking down the street and you see someone, they stop you and they start talking to you, and in your mind you're like, man, I really hope they mention their name because I have no idea what their name is. Or even worse, when you're with someone and you're kind of praying that they introduce themselves to the person next to you that they don't know because you don't know how to introduce them. I have a feeling that I'm not the only person in the room that has done that before. Even if I am the only one here, even if I'm just socially awkward, which I know I am, I'm not alone. I know I'm not alone. Because in the Bible, we see that Jesus ran into a lot of people who did the same exact thing to him. They had every reason to recognize Jesus for who he was, but they completely missed him. They might have seen him around town, they might have walked alongside him, they might have eaten dinner with him, but when it came time, when it came down to things, they really didn't understand who he was. And so we're going to look at an example of that this morning from the book of Mark. So if you want to open your Bibles, or it's going to be on the screen, we're going to be reading from Mark 6, verses 1 through 6. Jesus left there and went to his hometown accompanied by his disciples. So in the previous chapter, Jesus left there. He was actually not at home, not in his hometown. So he left from there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things? They asked. What's this wisdom that has been given to him? What are these remarkable miracles he is performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? And the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Imagine how quickly the tides turned there. They took offense at him. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown, among his relatives, and in his own home. And this is interesting. He could not do any miracles there except lay hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. So I want to point out two lessons from this story today. So Jesus is in his hometown. He's coming home, and you would think that this would be a group of people that's pretty safe to be around, that they would know who he is, that they would recognize and understand him. And he starts teaching, and he's in the synagogues. People love listening to him, and they're really impressed with him. And then all of a sudden they start to think, well, who is this guy? Like, who does he think he is? And Mark includes this curious detail in the story that Jesus couldn't do any miracles there, and so he kind of just moved on. And there are two lessons from this story that I want to point out today. And the first lesson is that familiarity breeds apathy. So there's this repeated theme in Mark's gospel, and it's a question. The question is, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Not only does Mark tell stories of people asking themselves the same thing, but I think through these stories he's actually asking his reader that question. Reader, who is Jesus? Who do you say that Jesus is? The climax of the Gospel of Mark is actually Peter's confession, where Jesus says, Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of God. So the question is it's a repeating theme throughout the book. Who is Jesus? And then the first 6 chapters of Mark's Gospel, and onward, but we're in chapter 6 right now, so I'll give you kind of a summary of what happened before. He gives us example after example of people who understand Jesus' identity, who understand who he is and what he has come to do, and examples of people who completely misunderstand and misidentify him. And what's amazing about the way that Mark kind of frames and shapes his gospel is that he points out and highlights the fact that the people who should know Jesus don't. And the people who have every reason to not recognize him, not know who he is, they're the ones who actually understand who he is. Here's what I mean. I love charts. I've been made fun of before, but it's just kind of how I process information. I like charts, so hopefully you do too, because I'm going to use one today. So here's a list of characters in the Gospel of Mark that understand Jesus' identity. Obviously God. That's the baptism story where God comes down from heaven and the Holy Spirit descends upon him, and God says, this is my Son, with whom I am well pleased. What's funny about the book of Mark is that the first 2 characters in the story that recognize Jesus are God and a demon. And so Jesus is walking along, and there's a man who's possessed, and he immediately, the demon within him cries out, Jesus Christ, Son of God, do not come near me. Later on, there's a stranger with leprosy. After that, even more demons recognize Jesus. That famous story where Jesus drives out a herd of demons, thousands of them, out of a person. And then there's this Gerasene synagogue leader. And kind of couched within that story of that synagogue leader, Jairus, his daughter died. It's the story of a woman who has been plagued by this disease that has made her bleed for 12 years. And the land of the Gerasenes was across the Sea of Galilee. It was pretty far from Jesus' hometown. And Jesus, he's not super well known at this point. He's gathering crowds, but across the Sea of Galilee, this is kind of new territory for him. So these are people that don't really have any reason to know that this is the Christ, the Son of God. But they do. They're strangers. And what's interesting is that all of these characters proclaim who Christ is before he even does anything. Even God. Right? Jesus is baptized. This is the first revelation of who Jesus is. It's before he even started his ministry. Before Jesus drives the demons out, it's literally approaching them, and they cry out, Jesus Christ, Son of God. So these characters in Mark's Gospel, before Jesus even does anything, they recognize either who he is, or that even if they don't have a full picture of who he is, they recognize that they need him. And now here's a list of characters in the Gospel who don't understand who Jesus is. His family, his disciples, and his neighbors. And what's interesting is that these stories, these are stories of Jesus like very dramatically displaying his power. And these characters still question who he is. That story in Mark 4 where Jesus is on the sea with his disciples, and there's a storm that is whipped up. And Jesus literally stands up in the boat and speaks to the waves and the wind and calms them. And the disciples go, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" Well, actually, they're inadvertently quoting a psalm where it proclaims that the wind and the waves obey the voice of God. But they still had no idea who Jesus was. They didn't understand him. So hopefully this is helpful for you. It's helpful for me. Mark is kind of setting up a dichotomy here that he wants us to pay attention to. And I think he's warning us, Mark, the gospel writer, is warning us that it's possible to have been around Jesus your entire life, but completely miss out on what he is doing. Have you ever moved to a new house, and in the week leading up to your move, you start to get really sentimental? That's kind of what I'm going through now. My wife and I we lived in our current house, not very long, but long enough. We've lived there for about 2 years, and we just sold it yesterday, actually. So I'm, in this right now, going through this process of selling our house, and as we are going through this process, I'm kind of walking through our house and just really, for the first time almost, appreciating it. I've spent a lot of time complaining about it. I've spent a lot of time fixing it up because it has some quirks. I've spent a lot of time deep cleaning it because we have a 3-year-old and 2 cats. But I've never actually spent that much time truly appreciating it. And now that I'm leaving, I'm starting to realize what a blessing it's been. And I think Mark is warning us against this exact kind of thinking. Don't let your familiarity with Jesus breed apathy. Don't become so familiar with Jesus that you are unwilling to be surprised by him. There's a curious little detail in the story where Mark says that Jesus couldn't do any miracles in his hometown. I don't think it's that he couldn't physically do any miracles or that the conditions had to be right for him to do one, but it sounds like Jesus was frustrated that people who had been around him his entire life still had no idea who he truly was. So really, what difference was another miracle going to make? These people had become so used to him that he really, what difference was another miracle going to make? And it's interesting because the demons, right, whose entire existence was to oppose God, recognized who Jesus was immediately. But his disciples, his family, his neighbors, who supposedly have this intimate connection with Jesus, are still asking, who is this man? Here's a picture that drives me crazy every time I see it. This is a photo of the moment, this happened a couple of weeks ago. This is the moment LeBron James broke the all-time NBA points record. So this is his 38,390th point as an NBA player. And it's an amazing, iconic photo of one of the greatest moments in sports history, and arguably the greatest moment in NBA history. Now, what I want you to notice here is not LeBron. I want you to look at the crowd. Imagine going through the exact correct steps to be in this moment, right? You've spent hundreds, maybe thousands of bucks on your ticket to this once-in-a-lifetime event. These people are fortunate enough to be on the exact same end of the court that this shot happened on. They didn't get up to go to the bathroom or get a hot dog when it happened, so they were there. Now imagine going through all of those correct steps and then witnessing the event through your phone screen. There's not one person in that picture except for one who is not looking at that moment through the screen of their phone. I could have done that. from home. It drives me crazy. Now look at the expression of this guy in the front row. That's Phil Knight. That's the founder of Nike. So he's rich. He has a lot. He's done a lot. But he knows that he has not seen or done this yet. And this is what the moment is all about. There are hundreds of people in this picture. I zoomed in, but it's hundreds of people in this picture, and there is one person who is actually witnessing the moment. And I think that's a really kind of powerful illustration of what we do today, especially in the church. Imagine the frustration that Jesus must have felt. You know, he's with his neighbors, his friends, his family. They're all seeing with their eyes and hearing with their ears what Jesus is doing. They're physically there, right? They're witnessing it happen, but they're completely missing the point. And before we, look down upon them and laugh at their arrogance, I think we should take a look at our own hearts first and realize that we often do the same thing. There are people who have been to church their entire life. It's a part of who they are, right? That's the American identity. You work, you have a family, you have a house, you have a yard that you take care of, that you mow on the weekends. You might go conservative, right? And you go to church on Sundays. That's part of who you are. It's what you do. You're kind of immersed in Christian values, but it's still possible, despite the fact that you've been around the church, you've been around Jesus your entire life. It's possible for you to completely miss out on his message and what he's doing. And if that's you, it's me this morning as well. I'm not exempting myself from any of this. I want to remind us that, mere familiarity with Jesus is not the goal. That's not why he came. We tend to become so familiar with the idea of Jesus, we tend to neglect the message of Jesus, right? We take the things that we like about him, but then we ignore the things that he is calling us toward, which often are less comfortable. I went to a conference this week with Anthony, actually, and I brought a lot of quotes back with me because I was taking notes. And there's a pastor named Albert Tate, and he said this: maybe we've become so familiar with the one who has been faithful that we have forgotten how to be fruitful. Jesus doesn't he doesn't just want your admiration. He wants your encounter with him to be the catalyst that transforms every aspect of your life. So that is lesson 1. Familiarity breeds apathy. And lesson 2 from the story is that amazement at Jesus is not the same as faith. Amazement at Jesus is not the same as faith. And sometimes when I preach a message like this, I want to clarify. I'm not speaking from a place of I have all this figured out and I'm telling you what you should do. I'm on this journey with you, right? I don't want to act like I'm scolding you from the pulpit. That's not what I'm trying to do here. But I think Mark is holding us over 2,000 years of history through his stories. Not really, but I feel like that's kind of, I just felt like I needed to clarify that. I'm not trying to speak from a place of superiority. Amazement at Jesus is not the same as faith in Jesus. So I want to read the story again, and I want to point something out. Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples, and when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked? What's this wisdom that has been given to him? What are these remarkable miracles he is performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Are his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. He could not do any miracles there except lay hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. You see that? They were amazed at Jesus, and he was amazed at their lack of faith. Now, full transparency here. I did my due diligence. These words are not the same in the Greek. So there's a lot of translations that won't translate these, the same way. But I think what happened here is that the NIV, the people who translated the NIV, are noticing something here. They're emphasizing a point, and I think still, even though the words aren't the same in the original language, I think the point is right on track. And I think what they've noticed, what I've noticed too, is that Mark seems to be making a really intentional contrast here between amazement and faith. Right? The crowd was amazed at Jesus and his miracle working. They were following him and they were listening to him, and they liked what he had to say. That Jesus, he speaks well, he teaches well, he does some cool miracles, and that gives us reason to follow him and be impressed by him. But that's not faith. I think Mark is pointing out that mere amazement at Jesus is not faith in Jesus. Here's a quote from a man named Ricky Gervais, who is a widely known and outspoken atheist. And you could say that Ricky Gervais is also impressed by Jesus. He says this: Jesus was a man. Also, I'm not going to do this, but he's British, so if you want to read this in a British accent, that might make it a little bit more come to life a little bit. Jesus was a man. And if you forget all that rubbish about being half God, that's not true, and believe the non-supernatural acts accredited to him, he was a man whose wise words many other men would still follow. His message was usually one of forgiveness and kindness. There are wonderful virtues, but I have seen them discarded by many so-called God-fearers when it suits them. By the way, this is a blog post that Ricky wrote called Why I Am a Better Christian Than Most Christians. He said, God allowed, if I could change one thing for a better world, it would be for all mankind to adhere to this little gem. This is from John 8. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I assure you, no more stones will ever be thrown. Maybe we should go back to basics and find out where it all got confused. The text quote is from a guy named Rhett McLaughlin. He's an internet celebrity. He's actually after my time, so I'm not super familiar with him. But he's a famous internet celebrity who was a Christian. He kind of went through a deconstruction of his faith. Now he calls himself a hopeful agnostic. And he says this: "Well, it's difficult to respond to he is risen, but he is risen indeed." This is a post from his Instagram page on Easter. "I'm still compelled by the person of Jesus. I love that he seemed less interested in what people thought and more interested in them loving one another. I love that he always sided with the poor, the exploited, and the disadvantaged. I love that he answered violence and hate with love, even to the point of his own death. I want to be more like Jesus." Here's Gandhi. "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." So make no mistake, right? Make no mistake. Jesus was compelling. He was impressive. He was amazing. Even to this day, to people who want nothing to do with him. There are aspects of his character, his philosophy, his posture toward people that people want to emulate. There are aspects of Jesus, even in today's culture, that are palatable. They sound good, right, to our 21st century Western sensibilities. But simply being impressed by Jesus, simply liking what he's all about, or agreeing with him, is not the same as faith. And I think that's what Mark was trying to get across here in this story. It's that famous breakup line. I think it's from a movie. You don't love me, you love the idea of me. I think Jesus is calling his people to a higher level of devotion, not simple agreement or amazement, but oftentimes that's an awesome start. There's a lot of people, I've met quite a few people that, in speaking with them, they're very compelled to learn more about Christ, about Jesus, about faith. They're compelled to go to church, and that's a great start. But Jesus calls us to a higher level of devotion and belief that his way of life, the way of life that he calls us to to the exclusion of all others, is the way to abundant, eternal joy. Jesus didn't call his people toward a philosophy, right? He invited his people to a literal new reality. There's a book I'm reading called Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. And the book is all about how the prophets, and Jesus was considered a prophet, the prophets didn't just speak the truth of God, they painted a picture of this new reality that God was inviting them toward. A literal new way of life that God was calling them to embody. And Jesus says that this way of life, this life that I'm calling you toward, this is the only path that will lead to abundant, eternal joy. Another speaker that I heard this week, she said something I really liked. Her name is Faith Yui Cho. She said that the good news of the gospel is a friendship with the eternal presence of God. Jesus wasn't just calling you to believe or agree with him or be, and to some level he didn't care how amazed people were by him. He was calling them to a new reality. He was calling them to a friendship with the eternal presence of God. It's impossible to say, I like what Jesus was all about, and maybe that's a great start, but that's not the same thing as faith. It's like having a steak on your plate and taking pictures of it and talking to your friends about it and talking about how good it looks, and then you get up from the table without actually eating it. There are people who would agree, probably, that Jesus was a good guy, but it's one thing to like him, another thing to know him, and still another thing to take up your cross and follow him. And I want to remind you this morning that Jesus isn't just asking for your lip service. He's inviting you to reconcile with God and surrender your sins and join him on a path that leads to life. And this path that leads to life is I'm trying to say this carefully here. He wants you to lay down all that in your life that leads to death and disease and decay, and take up your cross and follow him into a new reality that is defined by eternal resurrection life. I'm sorry, I lost my place a little bit there. I lost my train of thought. It happens. So, good news, according to Mark this morning. It was kind of a tough one to swallow on some level, but there are two lessons that we've learned from this passage in Mark. The first one is that familiarity breeds apathy. It's possible to become so familiar with Jesus that we forget who he is and we don't recognize him in the first place. And the second lesson that we learned was that amazement at Jesus, agreement with Jesus, is not the same as faith in Jesus. So will you pray with me this morning? God, thank you for your word, which often is very convicting. It convicts us. And I pray that if that's us this morning, if we find ourselves in one of those two places, that we've become so familiar with who you are, that your Spirit would surprise us, even today, that we would come to the knowledge that the reality that you're inviting us toward is so much greater and so much more beautiful than anything that we could construct on our own. And thank you that you made a way for us to follow you down a path that leads to resurrection hope. God, thank you for the church, for the opportunity to come speak this morning, and I pray that as we go from here, we would just remember the life that you have called us to, that you're not asking just for our lip service, you're not asking for our amazement, you're asking for us, you're asking for our devotion to your cause. All these things in the name of God. Amen.